Welcome to the webinar on determining eligibility for alternate assessment. My name is Bethany Spangenberg, and I am the Director of Alternate Assessment for the Arizona Department of Education. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Alternate Assessment website. During the live webinar, please keep yourself on mute and use the chat box to ask questions or to make comments. As we proceed, please remember that individual student information must be kept confidential. Also, the ADE Alternate Assessment Unit is unable to determine eligibility because federal law reserves that responsibility for IEP teams. State assessments provide an opportunity for students to show what they know and can do in relation to grade level standards. The MSAA is an alternate assessment that measures academic content that is aligned to and derived from the state's content standards. MSAA is designed to assess students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. The test contains many built-in supports that allow students to take the test and communicate what they know and can do as independently as possible. MSAA is administered in the areas of ELA and mathematics in grades 3 through 8 and 11. The new regulation in ESSA changed the 1% threshold calculation. Previously, percentage for the 1% threshold was calculated based on the number of students proficient in alternate assessment. Now it is calculated based on the number of students participating in alternate assessment. This change has brought attention to eligibility determination. Test coordinators have developed their own systems for monitoring participation. Some require all IEP teams to submit evidence along with the checklist found in the eligibility document. Others are able to review every IEP. Some participate in IEP meetings. If you have a system that works well, please share it with others. For those of you who are new or need ideas to improve your system, reach out to another test coordinator. ADE is responsible for monitoring LEAs that exceed 1% participation in alternate assessments. Although ADE cannot make eligibility determinations, we do monitor that the evidence supports the determination based on eligibility criteria. More information on the 1% threshold is presented in a separate webinar. There are 3 questions regarding eligibility determination. Does the student have a significant cognitive disability? Is the student learning linked to grade level state content standards? And does the student require extensive, direct, individualized instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains in the grade appropriate curriculum? LEAs may not change eligibility criteria in order to meet the 1% threshold. We will look at each of these criterion individually. The first criterion is evidence of a significant cognitive disability that impacts intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. This means that students must have scores from standardized academic, cognitive, and adaptive behavior tools. Only students who exhibit no observable communication may not have scores for academic or cognitive tests, but they should still have attempts. All students must have adaptive scores. Additional evidence of a significant cognitive disability should come from several different sources. Some examples are listed on the eligibility criteria form, such as classroom or district assessments, and English language assessments if applicable. ADE does not have cutoff scores to meet this eligibility. The guidance is to make sure IEP teams are having the conversation about meeting eligibility for alternate assessments when cognitive, academic, and adaptive scores are around 70. Keep in mind, though, that if we are talking about students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, which is our lowest 1% of students, a standard bell curve would indicate scores closer to 55. The second criterion is that instruction is linked to grade level state content standards. This part is critical for the design of the assessment. Because the goal of the assessment was to develop a system, instruction, goals and objectives, and grade level standards must all align. This means that if a student's IEP goals state that the student is working on writing his name and counting with one-to-one correspondence, the student does not qualify for alternate assessment. These functional skills should be taught embedded in lessons aligned to grade level standards. When teachers use research-based instructional strategies and interventions, students will be best prepared for alternate assessments. For more resources on grade level standards, look at the core content connectors posted on the website and at the performance level descriptors, either on the website or on the student reports. Furthermore, goals aligned to core content connectors must be in place to allow for suitable instructional time prior to assessment. This should be a minimum of 3 to 4 months, which also corresponds to the closing of the student selector application in the fall. The third criteria: the student requires intensive instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable gains. Evidence can be taken from examples of curriculum, instructional objectives, and work samples taken from both school and community-based instruction, teacher-collected data, and documentation in the IEP for present levels of academic and functional performance, goals and objectives, and post-school outcomes or transition plans. Please note that placement in self-contained setting does not meet this criterion. The IEP must document the student's needs and supports. We will look more at documentation in the eligibility form later on. In addition to sources of evidence, some considerations should not be used or not be used in isolation. Disability category, anticipated results of the general assessment, and the student's primary setting or placement are the most frequent explanations heard from the field for determining eligibility. Disability category, along with evidence from standardized cognitive and academic assessments and adaptive rating scales, may be used as eligibility considerations, keeping in mind that we are providing an opportunity for students to show what they know and can do in relation to grade level standards. Determining eligibility for alternate assessment for the purpose of passing a test does not provide this opportunity. Likewise, many schools create programs for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities in self-contained settings as a way of addressing the student's needs. This does not mean that a student must be in a self-contained setting to be eligible for alternate assessment, nor does it mean that a student with the most significant cognitive disabilities cannot be successful in a general education setting. Furthermore, anticipated emotional impacts and disruptive behavior are most frequently cited by parents and teachers. Helping to understand the expectations, resources, and assessment design will eliminate conversations around these non-examples. When students understand the testing experience and know what is expected of them, emotional impacts and behaviors decrease. Please use sample items, practice tests, and high-quality standards-based instruction to prepare students for state assessments. With the change in the calculation for the 1%, it is important to remember that the IEP team should not be discouraged from determining that a student is eligible for alternate assessment because the LEA is over 1%. Exceeding 1% will not lead to punitive consequences. Criteria may. Breaking down the trends for students who participate in alternate assessments can be helpful. This information can be compared with students at the LEA level. It can also be helpful during IEP team meetings when eligibility criteria is discussed. More information on student characteristics is presented in the Learner Characteristics Inventory webinar. This information also helps to solidify how the assessment is designed. AIMS A Science and MSAA are designed only for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities and are not able to provide information on how well students who don't meet eligibility criteria perform on grade level standards. Let's look more closely at some of these disability categories. Students with intellectual disabilities account for about 49% of the students who participate in alternate assessments. This disability category indicates that a student does have a cognitive disability. Many students who qualify for special education under this category do qualify for alternate assessments. However, this is not always the case. A student with MIID may not be a student with the most significant cognitive disability. Many students with autism also qualify for alternate assessments. However, the IEP team must ensure that they have evidence to support that the student has low cognitive, academic, and adaptive scores, as well as using other sources of evidence that all eligibility criteria are met. Of all the students in the state with the autism category for special education, only about 26% are determined eligible for alternate assessments. The specific learning disability by definition indicates that the student does not have a significant cognitive disability. A speech language impairment does not indicate that the student has low cognitive, academic, or adaptive scores. Students with multiple disabilities or traumatic brain injury may or may not qualify for alternate assessment, depending on how the disabilities impact the student's intellectual functioning and academic behavior. Emotional disabilities are not part of eligibility criteria for alternate assessments. In fact, behavior needs are on the list not to consider for eligibility. Students' behavioral needs should be addressed in the classroom to prepare the student for state testing long before testing windows open. Similarly, when other health impairment is the primary disability for a student because the student has been diagnosed with ADHD, this is not an indication that the student meets eligibility criteria. IEP teams must consider evidence that the student's health impairment is tied to a significant cognitive disability. Eligibility should always be an IEP team discussion for students with disabilities. It should never be assumed based on disability category. Now we will practice. The following examples are not meant to be a quiz to test your knowledge of eligibility. These scenarios are designed to help identify the discussions needed during eligibility determination. If you are watching the recorded webinar, be prepared to pause the recording to have discussion with your group or to jot down your thoughts when considering eligibility. These examples are not based on real students. Likeness to any student is purely coincidental. As we look at each example, ask, what evidence supports eligibility? What evidence does not support eligibility? And what additional information is needed before eligibility can be determined? Example 1. A student in grade 7 has a primary special education category of autism. The student has cognitive and academic scores in the mid-70s. There are no adaptive scores available for the student. The student's IEP goals for math are multi-digit multiplication, and for reading are reading single-syllable sight words. For the recorded webinar, pause the recording now to take notes. The autism category may or may not indicate a student with a significant cognitive disability. Cognitive and academic scores in the mid-70s is rather high for what we would consider a student with the most significant cognitive disability. However, not having adaptive scores means that eligibility cannot be determined. The MET would need to conduct a reevaluation to include adaptive scores before the IEP team could have a discussion about eligibility for alternate assessments. Furthermore, IEP goals of multi-digit multiplication at grade 7 are not aligned to grade level standards. By grade 7, students should be using a calculator. Similarly, reading single-syllable sight words in grade 7 is not a grade level standard, and this foundational skill should be embedded in instruction. Example 2. The student in grade 2 has a developmental delay category. The student is learning pre-academic skills. He displays aggressive behavior when presented with difficult academic tasks. For the recorded webinar, pause the recording now to take notes. Students with developmental delays may or may not qualify for alternate assessment. The IEP team would need to look at cognitive, academic, and adaptive scores for more information on how the disability impacts the student's intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. Most likely, a student in grade 2 with a developmental delay will have a reevaluation soon. Since this student is in grade 2, there is time to conduct a full evaluation and determine eligibility for alternate assessments. However, instruction must be linked to grade level standards with these pre-academic skills embedded. Again, there is time to review the IEP and write goals linked to grade level standards using core content connectors. There are many strategies the teacher can use to support the student's behavior during instruction, transitions, unstructured time, and to prepare for state assessments. Behavior is not a consideration. Example 3. The MET team completed an initial evaluation for a student in grade 5. The student qualifies for special education with a specific learning disability. The student will be receiving special education services in the resource room. Parents are supportive of the students taking alternate assessments. For the recorded webinar, pause the recording now to take notes. Students with significant cognitive disabilities are usually identified before kindergarten, although there could be some circumstances that the student would first be evaluated in grade 5. However, by definition, a specific learning disability does not indicate that the student has a cognitive disability. Placement is not a consideration for eligibility. However, students who need extensive direct instruction and substantial supports must have this documented in the IEP regardless of placement. The parent alone does not make the decision for participation in alternate assessment, but plays a vital role in the decision-making process as part of the IEP team when eligibility criteria is followed. The suggestion would be to inform the parents on eligibility criteria so they can effectively participate in the IEP team conversations. Example 4. A student in grade 10 has a primary special education disability category of MOID with a secondary category of SLI. The student has cognitive, academic, and adaptive scores in the 50s. The student participates in community-based learning. He has taken alternate assessment for 6 years. For the recorded webinar, pause the recording now to take notes. Although these pieces of isolated evidence does not guarantee eligibility, nothing on this slide is contrary to the eligibility criteria. The disability category, along with the scores from standardized assessments, indicates that this is a student with the most significant cognitive disability. Participation in community-based learning could be part of the evidence used for the third criterion of the need for extensive instruction and substantial supports to achieve measurable goals. The IEP would also need to document goals and instruction linked to grade level standards. Although the student has participated in alternate assessment for 6 years, this does not mean that the student continues to qualify. However, based on the other information we have about the student, the IEP teams have consistently followed eligibility criteria over the years when making assessment decisions for the student. Example 5. A student took AZ Merit last year in grade 3 and received a performance level 1 for both ELA and mathematics. The student has IEP goals and objectives for math, ELA, speech, OT, and social skills. The student is an English learner, and the district is over the 1% threshold. For the recorded webinar, pause the recording now to take notes. None of this information supports eligibility for alternate assessment, so more information would be needed for each eligibility criterion. Although we want all of our students to do well, the student must be given the opportunity to show what she knows and can do in relation to grade level standards. A test designed specifically for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities does not provide this opportunity to those students who do not meet eligibility criteria. This student certainly has some extensive needs, with the many goal areas, but again, the IEP team needs to look at all of the evidence for the student. The fact that the student is an English learner is not to be considered for eligibility determination, but is only to be considered for the validity of the evaluation process and to rule out the impact of language on one or more potential disabilities. The fact that the district is over 1% participation is if an IEP team shows eligibility criteria and guidance and has determined that the student is eligible for alternate assessment, neither participation percentages nor administrative decisions may change the determination. This is in federal law that clearly designates the IEP team to make the determination. However, in this example, much more information is needed to determine eligibility. Now we will look at the form itself. There are 3 changes to the eligibility form after review from both assessment and special services offices at ADE. The changes are reflected in statements for the plan, evidence, and specifying the year. The previous form had a note regarding consideration of suitable instructional time before administration windows. To clarify this point, statements were added to the introduction paragraph, description of the second criterion, and the statement of assurance before the signature page. Historically, IEP teams were not consistently determining eligibility with suitable instructional time. These statements not only help the documentation of the plan for students' instruction and assessment over the course of the IEP year, but also assist test coordinators in meeting deadlines and monitoring eligibility determination. Evidence boxes were added below each criterion. The boxes provide an opportunity for the IEP team to document the discussions around the evidence gathered and how it was used in determining eligibility. The purpose of adding these boxes impacts several different audiences. It covers the IEP team if follow-up questions are asked by parents because it encourages good documentation of eligibility determination. It allows test coordinators to monitor eligibility determination and to evaluate if additional training is needed. And it streamlines the state monitoring process if the LEA exceeds 1% participation rates. For ESS monitoring, those teams will not be looking at the description boxes this year. They will continue to monitor only that the form is filled out. For IEP teams determining eligibility for the following school year, there's a text box to indicate which year the student will participate. For example, an IEP team determining eligibility in grade 2 or 9, or in the spring, may indicate that the student will not participate until the following year. For determinations made in September or October for students in grades 3 through 8, 10, and 11, it will be clear that the student will participate in the coming spring. Now we have reviewed eligibility criteria and looked at some examples. For the live presentation, please type your questions into the chat box. Keep in mind that to maintain student confidentiality, we will not be addressing eligibility for a specific student. Please contact me separately if you'd like to have a conversation about a student. I hope you have clarity on eligibility criteria for alternate assessment. If you need further assistance with eligibility or alternate assessment, please contact the alternate assessment unit. Thank you.